You already know exactly how a baby is made. It's taught in school, printed in textbooks, explained before most people are even 10 years old. But that knowledge, the direct link between sex and pregnancy, is not something every human society throughout history simply figured out on its own. In fact, for a surprising stretch of human history, and in some documented cultures well into the 20th century, that link wasn't obvious at all. The story of how humans came to understand where babies actually come from is stranger, slower, and far more revealing about the human mind than you'd expect. Start with the basic problem your ancestors faced. Sex and childbirth are separated by roughly 9 months. 9 months is a long time. Long enough that connecting one single event to a delayed outcome 9 months later is not the obvious automatic conclusion it seems like today. Compare that to eating spoiled food and getting sick an hour later. That connection is easy for any brain to make. A 9-month delay is a completely different kind of puzzle, one that requires tracking, memory, and pattern recognition across a huge span of time, without calendars, without writing, and often without a fixed concept of counting months at all. This is where anthropology gets genuinely strange. In the early 20th century, anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski spent years living among the Trobriand islanders of Papua New Guinea, documenting their beliefs about how pregnancy occurred. According to Malinowski's field research, many Trobrianders did not believe that sexual intercourse caused pregnancy at all. Instead, pregnancy was explained through the arrival of ancestral spirits, called baloma, who entered a woman's body and became the child. Sex was understood as something that opened the way, but the spirit, not the act itself, was considered the true cause of new life. This wasn't ignorance in the way people often assume. The Trobrianders were not confused or unintelligent. They had a coherent, internally consistent belief system that explained reproduction in spiritual terms, and it worked well enough within their culture to be passed down for generations. Malinowski's account has been debated and re-examined by later anthropologists, some arguing the beliefs were more layered and symbolic than a simple either-or explanation. But the core finding still stands as one of the most striking examples in anthropology of a human culture, organizing an entire worldview around reproduction without centering the biological mechanism you take for granted. Zoom out further, and you find similar patterns across the historical and ethnographic record. Many cultures explained pregnancy through spirits entering the womb, through ancestors being reborn, through the moon, through specific foods or rituals believed to activate fertility. These weren't random guesses thrown out carelessly. They were serious attempts to explain a genuinely difficult biological mystery using the tools available. Observation, storytelling, and pattern recognition stretched across an enormous and confusing time gap. So how did some societies eventually make the connection? Animal husbandry offers one likely answer. Once early humans began domesticating animals, particularly herd animals like goats, sheep, and cattle, they were suddenly watching reproduction happen constantly, in a controlled setting, with animals they personally managed. If you separate a male and female animal, no offspring appears. Reintroduce them, and months later, offspring reliably does appear. Repeat that pattern across dozens of animals, dozens of times, and the correlation becomes almost impossible to miss, even without any formal science behind it. Archaeologists and anthropologists have long noted that some of the clearest early evidence of humans understanding male paternity in a biological sense appears alongside the rise of pastoralism, herding cultures who were tracking breeding cycles deliberately for practical reasons to manage their herds and predict new animals being born. It's a compelling theory, though not without debate. Some researchers argue that many hunter-gatherer societies likely understood the reproductive link long before herding began, simply through careful observation of their own communities over generations, tracking who partnered with whom, and noticing the recurring pattern despite the long delay. What's clear either way is that this knowledge was not universal, was not instant, and did not arrive the same way in every culture on Earth. It had to be built, tested, and passed down, sometimes taking thousands of years to become the kind of fact your teacher casually mentioned once in a classroom and expected you to remember. There's something worth sitting with here. The idea that reproduction requires this specific, mechanical, biological explanation feels so obvious to you today that it's almost hard to imagine believing anything else. But that feeling of obviousness is itself a kind of illusion, created entirely by the fact that you were handed the answer already assembled, without ever having to do the actual work of connecting a 9-month delayed outcome to a single distant cause. Your ancestors, without textbooks, without science classes, without anyone to simply tell them the answer, had to reconstruct one of biology's more subtle patterns using nothing but generations of careful observation, or, just as often, had to build a meaningful cultural explanation around the mystery instead. This is really a story about how human knowledge gets built at all. Not in one flash of insight, but slowly, unevenly, sometimes through spiritual frameworks that served real social and psychological purposes even when they weren't biologically accurate. The specific facts you were taught as a child, facts that feel like they've always simply been known, were often hard-won, culturally contested, and in places arrived at only after thousands of years of watching, wondering, and building explanations from the observable world. So the next time something feels completely obvious to you, something you've simply always known without ever questioning where the knowledge came from, remember the Trobriand islanders and their ancestral spirits. Somewhere behind almost every piece of obvious knowledge you carry is a long, forgotten history of human beings slowly figuring it out, one confusing 9-month delay at a time.